A year ago, I fractured my ankle and took to the stool out of necessity, and then I loved the vibe. It felt like a 90s sitcom, like today on a very special episode of All Souls. I think maybe one time since then I've preached without it, but I just feel like this coffee house chill vibe, and we're just all grooving with it. So, welcome. My name is Mike St. Dennis. I'm the associate pastor here at All Souls. So glad to have you here as we're worshiping together. I want to start this morning with a straw poll. If you would, raise your hand if you are one of those humble people. No takers. I mean, everybody in first service raised their hand, so I don't know what you're doing wrong. All right, what about if you have a diagnosable pride problem, right? Like family members, friends, people pointed out. Okay, I saw a couple hands. So we're not on the humble side, but we're not on the pride problem side? What's the deal, people? My hope is that by the end of this sermon, you will be able to walk away hearing from the scripture, that you'll feel convicted in some way about some aspect of how pride might be shaping your life. And then that you will also be able to feel comforted in finding your hope and your security a little bit more deeply in Jesus this week. So that's our hope. That's where we're hoping to go. Our topic this morning being pride, humility, inner emptiness, vainglory, that kind of deal, how God meets us in that. And it's a great topic for this week because if you've been following along in the news, just a few days ago, the Los Angeles Dodgers won the World Series. And I don't know if you know this, but the two pastors I have to work with, one's a Dodgers fan and the other's an Eagles fan. And it's just not a great place. So hopefully we can work on pride and humility. Seeing a lot of new faces this morning. We've been studying in the book of Esther. If you've never read it before, it's not a super long read. Go back, dive in, take a look at the first 5 chapters. It's really it's a great work of literature. The way that it's structured, the irony, the comedy that's in it, the double entendres, there's so much in there to cherish. And we've come to the middle part of the book. So this title today is the Fulcrum, or the turning point. It's been called the Great Reversal, or the Great Pivot, all kinds of things. But it's like, this is the point. This is where all the drama is cascading, crescendoing, coming together, is in this passage that we're going to look at here. If you haven't read the book of Esther in the Old Testament tells the story of God's people after they've been displaced from the promises. They've been exiled from the promised land, from temple worship. They've been taken away. They are in exile. They are refugees in the Persian kingdom. Now, this is the time when some have begun to go back to Israel and to go back to rebuild the walls and things like that. But we find the story here in I think it was the winter palace or summer palace of the Persian Empire. We find this story of Esther. So Esther, who is herself Jewish, is a refugee and an immigrant alongside her uncle Mordecai, and then she ascends from that low status into a place of power, becoming the queen of Persia, the most powerful nation on earth at the time. And alongside being queen and going from that rags to riches story, a plot develops to basically exterminate the Jewish people. And the book of Esther is unique because all along in the story, God's providence and his hand is at work, but the name for God doesn't appear in the book. And so the tension and the drama is, what will happen to God's people? What will happen to this person who's been put in a place of power? Not only that, but the second most powerful person in the kingdom, someone who reminds me of Jafar from Aladdin, Haman, has been made prime minister or second in command, and he is ethnically an Amalekite, a follower of the king Agag, and the Amalekites you see in the book of Kings. They are mortal enemies with the people of Israel. And so they're in exile and folded into this kingdom, and he's just got this rivalry, and he's got it out for the people there. And then specifically, Esther, the queen, he gets this rivalry going, and his arch enemy is in her uncle or cousin, Mordecai. So there's all this drama, and we pick it up here in the middle of the book, and in between two feasts. So this plot to exterminate the Jews has come to Esther's attention. Esther and Mordecai then are scheming to go ask the king to intervene. She invites him, taking her life into her own hands, invites him to a banquet where she's going to ask him. And then they get to the place where he's ready to hear her petition. And instead she says, not yet, come back tomorrow. And so this passage here is in between. God's people are on the line. Esther's life is on the line. What will happen with the promises? Rather than reading the passage straight through like we usually do, we're going to treat it more like a commentary, looking at a few verses at a time and then putting them sort of into our own language. If you have your Bible, turn to Esther chapter 5, or you can pull up the worship guide and look. We're going to begin in verse 9. Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. When he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth and his many sons and all the ways the king had honored him and how he had been elevated above the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all this gives me no satisfaction, as long as I see the Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. When I read that passage this week, I started to hear dun 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 dun, dun, right? Or maybe like, I'm walking on sunshine. The passage begins, Haman went out happy and in high spirits. Just came from a great banquet. Everything is going Haman's way. He's got the riches, the power, the influence. Hey, it's good to be Haman. And then you get the record screech. The musical gets interrupted when he comes to the gate, and Mordecai, who has this beef with him, refuses to rise and honor Haman. He's filled with rage. And he runs home to his wife and his friends so that they can lick his wounds. Going back to Shadowbox against Haman, and he begins by reading off his resume, by smelling himself. It's like the monologue of a Disney villain describing his vast wealth and sons and honors, and how he's really the one who's fit to be king or honored in high standing. But that's not all. He can't get any satisfaction. All the things that he has, and yet, as long as he sees the one thing he can't have, Mordecai honoring him, it's just all for nothing. Picking up in verse 14 then. So Haman's wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, have a pole set up, reaching to a height of 50 cubits, or about 75 feet, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go to the king's banquet and enjoy yourself. Not a bad to-do list. This suggestion delighted Haman. He's real easy to please. And he had the pole set up immediately. That night then, though, the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. The tallest building in the land was estimated to be about 55 feet. And this offense that Haman has undertaken, the solution that he finds delight in from his wife is, well, why don't you just put out a pole higher than any building and go ahead and impale him on it like a Mordecai shish kebab? And so Haman, excited, goes about doing it. But then the drama of the book is contained at the beginning of chapter 6 that says, that night the king could not sleep. So in this time when he can't sleep, he does what any of us would do. Now, Jonathan told me that when he couldn't sleep as a baby, Jeremy, who's a lawyer, would read to him from your law books or from the tax code. You would read the tax code to him, right? What I can't figure out is when the king can't sleep, is it like this, right? Read the royal records so I can sleep, the tax code, or is it more like tell me about me, right? But either way, the king can't sleep and he looks for a remedy. And it just so happens that either in the 3 to 5 year range after Mordecai has saved his life, they turn to that page and find out that Mordecai was never honored. So then the king wants to fix that. You can imagine, as the king, anybody who saves you from assassination, you certainly do want to reward and honor. The old principle goes, that which gets celebrated gets repeated. So he's trying to do that. And then we see this picking up again, chapter 6, verse 3. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received, the king asked. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. And the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer courts of the palace to speak to the king about his plan to impale Mordecai on the pole. His attendants answered, Haman is standing in the court. Well, bring him in, the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked him, Haman, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, who else out there would the king rather honor than me? So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, and one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, the one who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what's done for the man the king delights to honor. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate. But Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief and told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. And while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. So The king wants to reward Mordecai. He realizes that Mordecai hasn't been celebrated for his efforts. And like we've seen already with the king, he relies very heavily on his advisors because he really prefers banquets and the drink that goes along with making the decision, but he really needs to lean on other people's advice. And so he looks for an advisor who should happen to be there in the middle of the night, but Haman, who just can't sleep himself because he's got this Mordecai skewer back home he's waiting to use. Okay? The king asks, and isn't this a wonderful question, right? It's kind of like, what do you want or what do you seek? What should be done for the man whom the king delights in? And Haman, of course, can't see why that would be about anyone else and lays out his plan, and then this great irony and reversal takes place, culminating in his wife and friends saying, uh-oh, you've come against a man of Jewish origin, a person from the people of Israel. You've come against them and against their God. What comes next? Well, before we make some observations about the palace or the passage, I want to share a quick story with you. So a couple days ago, I was visiting with a friend of mine who has been on a journey of sobriety for the last almost 2 years. And this person's younger days were marked by a lot of tragedy and grief, the kinds of things that might make you weep. And it was kind of understandable that through all of these things that went on in their life, they developed a lot of coping and comforting habits. Like we all would do, they started out with things like friends and food and pleasure and adventure, and that wasn't really enough. So they looked to knowledge and success and accolades, and that really wasn't enough. And then ultimately found themselves caught up in drugs and drinking and changing from one partner to another, and nothing could comfort or satisfy. Until ultimately they found themselves on the verge of destruction, waking up one day from this cloud of checking out and coping, realizing that in that moment they had come up with a plan to end it all. And then thankfully they were aware just enough to get back home to people who could care for them and get into treatment. And here we are 1.5 years later, and they are doing so incredibly well. And God has used this event in their life to shape and change them, and also using it in their life in this story to use them in the lives of other people. And they were telling me that they've come to the point in their own journey where now they're being asked to take responsibility to partner with others, to become a sponsor for the people around them. And they came to me saying, I have a bit of a hesitancy about this. And they told me this story. They said, early in my journey, when I had a sponsor, they would ask me to do things that I can see now were good and helpful for me. And I lied and manipulated and avoided and excused as best I could with them. Until one day, they had asked me to do something, and I showed up to meet with them, and I hadn't done it, and they got up and left. And he said that moment in my life of hitting rock bottom was the time where my change really started to take place. And I don't know how I can come alongside other people if that's a necessary thing that's going to be needed for them to grow. You see, I'm afraid that I'm going to miss the mark. That when I go to confront them or to challenge them, that I'm going to blow up and rage the way I've always done. And I'm also insecure that in that moment I would abdicate, not even challenge or confront or share what I see going on. And so that's what I feel caught between: failure on the one hand to not bring anything up, or failure on the other to rage against them. And as we talked about that, he pointed me to this section in the book of AA that had been so instrumental for him recognizing how his sense of control, his self-centeredness, his pride had gotten in the way and prevented his healing. It says, whatever our protestations, are not most of us concerned with ourselves, our resentments, or our self-pity? Selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our troubles. Driven by 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-seeking, and self-pity, we step on the toes of our fellows, and they retaliate. Sometimes they hurt us, seemingly without provocation, but we invariably find that at some time in the past, we have made decisions based on the self, which later placed us in a position to be hurt. So our troubles, we think, are basically of our own making. They arise out of ourselves, and the alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot, though he usually doesn't think so. Above everything, we alcoholics must be rid of this selfishness. We must, or it kills us. And God makes that possible. Indeed, we had to have God's help. What this young man identified was the need to, at some level, be confronted for the facade and the pride and the false self that he had built up in his life. And he didn't want to do damage to other people in taking on that confrontation. But the question was, how else could then they be healed? Certainly, the pride in the description in this passage was able to map and diagnose most of the problems and errors we could see, but it didn't offer a solution, rather one more thing that we might not get right. And then we ask the question, what if there's something underneath that? What if the false self and the pride and self-centeredness that we live in isn't actually the root cause, but a symptom? What if there's something deeper? And the story that the Bible suggests is that the curse that has befallen us is not just one of pride and self-centeredness and the things that are justified along the way, but rather that is our response, our treatment protocol for something else, namely shame and emptiness. That the false self that we create, just like Haman's 75-foot tall pike, is in direct relation to the amount of emptiness, insecurity, fear, and loneliness that we feel. We are aware of these things and we encounter them and they eat us up, and then we try to outrun them exactly as far on the other side. In my own life, I recognized this last year because Stephen keeps pointing out this tendency to fall into some perfectionism, which blows my mind because I'm not good at making things perfect. But it's the ruminating and the pride and the false self and trying to figure it out that is killing me. And what I realize is that every bit of fear and anger and pain and loneliness and emptiness I experience, I set up, the next success has to be enough to cover that. And then when I miss the mark, then this just grows deeper. The pike right now for Haman may be 75 feet tall, but it's going to be 95 the next go around, and 110 after that, because the pride and the false self and the things we go around sharing and masquerading and planning is not the root, it's the symptom. And the symptom is the inner emptiness, the lack of glory, the disconnection between God, ourselves, and others. The things that our anger, our sadness, and our fear expose in us. What I want to do is make a few observations about the symptoms that we see in Haman's story. what does pride look like with him? And how might we use those things to diagnose some areas with us? The Bible understands you as a person who's made for great glory with God, but you're born into disconnection, and then you're on your way to restoration through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And like Paul says in Romans 7, there are good things that you want to do that you don't do, and you got some emptiness that results, and then there are bad things you don't want to do that you do, and then you got to find a way to make up for that. And so the question is not whether or not we have a pride problem. The question is, what's the symptom and the root cause, and how does God meet us there? So I hope as we go through this, maybe you'll see yourself, certainly you'll see others in this list. All right, 1, pride makes us self-absorbed. When Haman is slighted, what's the first thing that he does? He reads off his resume. He goes back to his primary audience, his wife, his family, his advisors, and he says to them, remember all those things that I did, and aren't I something? Anybody who's not going to see that and dismiss it surely is wrong. But he doesn't just point out the positives, he also undertakes the negatives. So it's possible that his pride is not just manifested in his accomplishments, but it's also in the pity of saying, I can find no satisfaction now. Isn't that just so unfair to me? You see, pride has less to do with whether you think high of yourself or really low of yourself. It's that you think of yourself, and a lot. You've heard the old adage that humility is not thinking of yourself, but it's thinking of yourself, or it's not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. So whether you're overly prideful or overly downtrodden, just the assumption and what we're consumed by is the same. It is the self. C.S. Lewis gets at this when he says, if you ever met a truly humble person, your first impression would not be that they are humble. Rather, you would notice that they are happy and they are very interested in you. To know what you say, to know what's going on in your life. Philippians 2 says, do nothing from selfish ambition, the ambition of filling your emptiness and making something of yourself, or out of vain conceit, the emptiness, but in humility count others as more important than yourself. Let each of you look after not only your own interests, but also after the interests of others. One of the treatments we have for self-absorption, whether it's in pride or in shame, is just think about others. And Philippians 2 begins to, therefore, in keeping with what God has already done in Jesus. But pride makes a person self-absorbed. The second symptom is that pride fosters comparison of others. You see, in 5:12, Haman, after his listing is accomplished, also says, Queen Esther didn't let anybody else come to that party. It was just for me. Comparing himself, who is like me. And comparing himself then to the king. So what do you get for the man who has everything but the kingship? The man who's the second in command in the kingdom, in the most powerful kingdom in the land. What do you get them? Well, the only thing left is really the kingdom. And so what does Haman desire and long for? Well, to be treated as the king and celebrated as the king. It's all that's left. So certainly all of his problems that he has in his life is really just because he hasn't gotten there yet. And once he does, magically, everything will all be made right. But then also Haman is caught comparing himself to others in a downward direction. You see, Haman has this main character syndrome going on and realizes that the whole point of the game is for him to win, and that the people in front of him are just obstacles to overcome, and the people beneath him are there to exclaim his glory. That Mordecai isn't a person with dignity and a story and a station of his own, but rather someone that is there to recognize Haman's glory. Pride makes comparisons with others. Thessalonians says that they who compare themselves by themselves and among themselves are not wise. I've heard that one a time or two from my mom. Next, pride parades itself. It seeks an audience. In verse 6-9, as Haman is painting the picture of what he desires from the king, you see that it is a parade. He wants to be on display. It's not enough to be delighted in by the king if no one else knows about it. It's not enough to be celebrated in the quiet. It's not enough to have opportunity. He needs an audience. He needs affirmation. Like Ralphie in the Christmas story, he dreams of people chanting his name and lifting him up on their shoulders, parading him around. But it's not just in the positive, it's also in the negative. You see, what would be the easiest thing to do if you're second in command in the largest kingdom in the world when somebody offends you or hurts you? Have them whacked. But Haman's plan is not, hey, take old Yeller out back. His plan is, let's build something taller than the tallest building and put it on display. He needs to be seen and his glory confirmed and celebrated by others. Next, pride is never satisfied. Haman's the second highest position. There's nobody who's doing it better, and yet there's still another place to go. Good enough is not good enough. A few weeks ago, Meredith and I switched phone companies after a young man knocked on our doors. Our first phone upgrades in 6 and 8 years. We were pretty excited. We sealed the deal after talking with him for way longer than he expected. A few hours after, or really even minutes, like he left, we ordered cases. We turned on the TV and found out that every other phone company is giving away even better phones than we got. Pride is never satisfied. When asked the question, how much is enough? Pride answers, just a little bit more. Commenting on his character from the Mad Men series, Pete Campbell, Vincent Kartheiser said, answering the question, do you understand why your character is so unhappy? And he says, with success comes a level of sadness, you think. Because you think to yourself, I'll reach this goal and then I'll feel a sense of completeness or wholeness. I'll feel that I have accomplished something. I will see myself as a worthy man. And then you get there and it doesn't exist. Who's to say if Haman did become the king, whether that then would his problems have been solved? The next symptom is fragility. Pride makes us angry and easily offended, but that's in part because we're so fragile. You see, Haman is unforgiving and vengeful. Resentment has built up in him. It's not enough just to have Haman killed. It has to be a spectacle. It's not just enough to be honored. It's got to be a spectacle. And there's this easy offense in his life. It's like pride. One of the ways it shows up, talking about this with somebody, is when other people get celebrated, they can't stand it. It hurts their feelings. They think, when was my celebration? They get angry and feel a sense of entitlement, saying like, well, they're being celebrated now, but I was never celebrated for this or for that, kind of a thing. And so there's just always this irritability and anger and offense that takes place, and they feel justified in it, or we do, rather. And Cornelius Plantinga, who is a philosopher, talked about this in his book, talking about the work of Milton Friedman on the Middle East. He pointed out that in the 1970s, there was an Israeli prime minister, Menachem Begin, who was a Jewish man from Poland who had been through World War II. He'd suffered in the Holocaust, lost family members, and seen these great atrocities. And when he became the prime minister, the idea that Israel would have tanks and bombs and jets was like a drug to him. The protection that he had longed for and not yet experienced, but more than that, the ability to seek out retribution. And Plantinga points out, as we all know, the cycle of violence and retaliation that has marked and characterized the region for decades since then. And what Plantinga says is that when the peace is disturbed and violated, the curious thing is you can never find anyone who fired the first shot. All you hear is, well, I was just responding to this thing that they did, and my response was justified, and you keep going and you can never find the source. The next symptom of pride is that it blinds us. It's kind of blind, like when you walk into a room when someone's asking what should be done for the one who the king wishes to honor, and you can't think of anyone else but yourself. And pride, as others have pointed out, it's like the carbon monoxide of sins because it's colorless and odorless and hard to identify when it's there because we become blind to it or used to it, like our own smell. But then, when someone else is in error, we are all too keen and aware of how big a deal it is what they have done. Taking on the nuclear option. And this is why Jesus says to the people, before you go and take the speck out of your brother's eye, make sure you take the log out of your own first. Because pride will blind you, and you don't want a blind surgeon. Next, pride is always a letdown. Jesus teaches the people that whoever exalts themselves will be humbled. And we know this in our own experience. It's why it can be uncomfortable to get praised for something or called out, because it's like, well, I did that once, I'm not sure I can do it again. And we don't want to be humbled when the expectations change around us. It's expected that if we really live in a place of pride or security inside ourselves, that doom and destruction is waiting around the bend. Pride goeth before the fall. We know that intuitively. Jim Collins, a business professor at Stanford, wrote a book called How the Mighty Fall. And they researched what happened in companies that went from the top of their game to bankruptcy. And they discovered 5 stages of the fall. And the first one is hubris born of success or pride. He says, stage 1 kicks in when people become arrogant regarding success as virtually an entitlement, and they lose sight of the true underlying factors that created success in the first place. This isn't just in businesses, this is in our own spiritual life. How did you get here? Because God lavished His grace upon you and met you and drew you to Himself. And then we say, well, how do we stay there? And we get a certain sense of entitlement, taking on control, getting angry and bitter when things don't go our way. And the road, just like for Haman, between the penthouse and the poorhouse is a road paved with pride. But one of the most important things to see in this passage is that ultimately it is not Mordecai or the king or Esther who oppose Haman, but it's God. Haman's wife says at the end, it's very clear the reason why you have been experiencing this destruction, the reason why your plans are not working out, you're not able to get where you want to be, is because you're not up against an ordinary person. You're up against a man who comes from the people of God in Israel. Proverbs 6 says there's 6 things that God hates, 7 that are detestable to him. Turns out they're all forms of pride. Now again, is self-centeredness and pride the symptom or the root cause? The turning point for the whole book is not just Haman's pride that's setting the context. It's not the faithfulness of Esther and Mordecai who are taking action, trusting in God's promises to deliver them. The turning point of the whole book has nothing to do with human effort. The turning point of the book is not when anybody acts, but in the phrase, that night, when the king could not sleep. You see, we are used to the drama in our lives and in the world around us being something like when Gandalf appears up on the high mountain with the king and the army of the Westfold, or when Harry leaps out of Hagrid's arms at the Battle of Hogwarts, or when Air Bud comes off the bench and sinks those free throws. We are waiting for the heroes to act, for that pride and that self to be realized, their glory to be bestowed upon them. But oftentimes, just like in Esther, in your life and mine, it happens when we're restless, when we can't sleep. On that night, God chose to act and to move. It doesn't explain why he didn't before that. And oftentimes we never find out. But God moves and works and acts when we don't, so that, Ephesians 2, we don't boast in it and create a false self or have to measure out of insecurity the next time whether God's going to do anything. But God moves in those dark, lonely, cold, mysterious places. The last thing that I want to say is this. Pride is misplaced longings. You see, God has made us for connection and belonging with others. He has made us for wealth and riches and glory. He has made us for power and stewarding it in the world. He made us for all of those things. And as Tim Keller says, it's not that Haman was asking for the wrong things, but rather that he was asking the wrong king. After he had won 3 Super Bowls, Tom Brady was asked the question, why do you keep going? And he said, people might look at me and see the Super Bowl rings and think there's something greater out there for me. Maybe a lot of people instead would say, hey man, this is what it is. You reached your goal, your dream, you've got your life. And then I think, God, it's got to be more than this. I mean, this isn't all that it's cracked up to be. I love playing football and being a quarterback for this team, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of other parts of me that I'm trying to find at the same time. Idolatry in the New Testament is being skewed, right? It's the word lust. It means you're skewed after some part of humanity. You're saying, if I can just get this one last thing, then I'll be okay. And God's saying you're meant for these things, but ultimately you're meant for all of them because you're meant for me. And you're looking for love in all the wrong places. The turning point here, when God moves, reminds us when we see that pride is the symptom and emptiness is the root cause, then we can see that someone like Haman is really the anti-Jesus. Haman is not the king. He's willing to kill and destroy to get the honor and the glory of the king for himself. But Jesus, who is the king, is willing to give up his robes to us, to take the form of a servant, to be impaled upon the stake, hung on the cross. And to do all of that so that you and I, the enemies of God can be put into a place of glory and royalty, to be paraded around as the one in whom the King delights in. Ephesians 2 says, "You were dead in your transgressions, driven by the gratification of your empty flesh, caught in a life of destruction. But because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead, by his grace." And God raises us up with Christ, exalts us, seats us in the throne room in heaven in Jesus, so that in the coming days and age, he might show us the incomparable riches of his grace through the kindness of Jesus Christ. Pride, self-centeredness, shame, and emptiness. Those are the symptoms that we face. It's the symptoms that and battles that humans have always faced and wrestled with. Because we aren't meant to be the source of our glory ourselves. And the invitation is to participate in the great reversal, not just in the book of Esther, but in the one who emptied himself so that we can be full. Will you let him become your identity? Letting go of the false self. Will you let his suffering become your suffering, so that we can be a people who move from blind to sight, from sick to healed, from death to life, in Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.